What was it like to be a German soldier in the final days of World War II? Not the version stamped in textbooks or staged in grainy newsreels, but the quiet, fragile truth that slipped between the cracks of collapsing cities and fading commands. Story of men who had once marched in lockstep and now found themselves wandering through ruins that no longer resembled a nation. Imagine for a moment that you are lying back in your bed, the room softly lit, maybe rain tapping against your window, or silence hanging heavy in the night, and I'm here to tell you a story that most people never hear. In those last weeks of 1945, Germany was less a country and more a labyrinth of broken streets, flickering candles, and hollow faces. Entire units dissolved without orders. Villages took in soldiers who no longer carried rifles, but carried hunger. Some men tore the insignia from their uniforms so that they might melt into crowds of refugees, while others clung to their tattered coats as if the last scrap of cloth still carried the weight of identity. But what makes this story strange, what makes it worth leaning closer to, isn't just the battles or the retreats. It's the tiny, unrecorded details. The soldier who tried to heat a tin of turnip soup over a candle stub in a schoolhouse cellar. The officer who quietly swapped his pistol for bread in the middle of a bombed-out market. Or the young boy pressed into the Volkssturm who fell asleep holding a wooden rifle, dreaming of games he would never play again. These are the things history books often glide past because they don't fit neatly into strategies or surrender. Documents. They are fragments of life clinging to the edges of collapse, and tonight we will trace them slowly, gently, like stepping stones across a river that once roared with violence but now drifts into silence. So before we begin, let me invite you to take a breath, feel the weight of your blanket, and settle into the rhythm of this quiet retelling. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the nights where forgotten stories come. Alive, whispered in tones soft enough to guide you toward rest. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Are you tucked away in a city buzzing faintly with distant cars, or somewhere quieter where the wind through the trees is the only companion? Either way, you are here now with this story, and the world outside can pause. Close your eyes if you'd like, because our scene is beginning. Picture a dimly lit farmhouse on the edge of a German village, the kind with cracked shutters and a kitchen that smells faintly of burned bread. A soldier leans against a wooden table, his uniform patched with threadbare cloth, his boots caked in frozen mud from a retreat that ended in nowhere. Outside, artillery rumbles far off, but here in the farmhouse there is only the tick of a cracked clock and the whisper of mice in the rafters. He has no maps left, no orders, no belief in victory, only the strange, quiet task of surviving a war that no longer has shape. This is where we begin, and in the nights to come we'll follow these soldiers not as shadows in history, but as men caught between endings and unknowns. And as you drift with me through these fragments, you may find that the stillness of their world is not so far from the stillness of your own night now. The farmhouse fades into the wider countryside. And now the night carries us down broken lanes where German soldiers wandered not as conquerors, but as displaced men searching for shelter in their own land, their footsteps crunching over frost and scattered brick. Imagine them moving past barns, half collapsed from shell fire, horses long gone, only the smell of hay and smoke lingering, while dogs barked nervously at figures who no longer seemed like masters of anything. Many of these soldiers were boys, some no older than 16, called into the Volkssturm with armbands and wooden rifles, while others were grizzled veterans who had marched since. Poland in 1939, their faces carved with exhaustion deeper than any wrinkle of age. In these final days, uniforms meant less than hunger. Belts were tightened to keep from fainting, helmets were bartered for bread, and boots were prized more than medals. Strange, small rituals filled their hours. Men pressing frostbitten hands against the embers of burned letters. Soldiers passing. A single cigarette around a cellar as though it were a sacrament, or carving notches into table edges, simply the mark that another day had passed without capture. There was a strange kind of humor, too, whispered in the gloom. the gallows jokes that made comrades chuckle. Despite the despair, one soldier scrawled on a ruined wall, "If Berlin still stands, then so do I," though he was in Hanover and Berlin was already crumbling. Another, when asked by a farmer's wife if the war was over, muttered, "Yes, but no one has told the generals yet," and the cellar filled with weary laughter before silence fell again. The weight of reality pressed down when they stumbled. Upon refugee columns stretching for miles, mothers carrying children, old men dragging carts, the sound of babies crying against the howl of distant artillery. Soldiers sometimes mingled into these streams, shedding their uniforms to blend into the faceless tide of survival, though some clung stubbornly to their insignia, as if the stitched eagles and runes still bound them to a cause that had already slipped into ashes. Food was the great obsession. Entire platoons disbanded over the rumor of a hidden pig in a village. Men risked being shot for raiding potato fields. There is a chilling detail recorded in diary soldiers boiling wallpaper, strips to scrape out the starch, or grinding acorns into bitter flour when bread was gone. These desperate acts blur into the night, yet each one tells us more about the strange edge of history than any battlefield report. And through it all, the strange coexistence of collapse and routine continued. Church bells still rang in some towns, though no congregations came. Trains still whistled down tracks, though they carried only ghosts of supplies. And soldiers still polished their rifles out of habit, even as the rifles themselves meant little against the tide. In one account, a soldier described watching a comrade spend half an hour brushing mud from his boots before collapsing into sleep on the same muddy ground, as though the ritual itself mattered more than the outcome. Perhaps this was the last. Defense against madness, holding on to some fragment of order while everything else unraveled. And yet, beneath the surface of this quiet endurance, there was a dawning awareness, spoken softly in attics, muttered over fires, that the war was truly lost, that what lay ahead was not victory but surrender, captivity, or death. Some men confessed relief in hushed tones, relief that the long march of blood and thunder might finally end, even if it ended in chains. Others could not let go, still sketching maps in the dirt, still listening for phantom orders. As you lie here listening, drifting deeper into the calm, imagine the soundscape of those nights. The creak of wagon wheels on frozen ruts, the hiss of a lone kettle on a stove, the distant rumble of Soviet artillery like thunder too far to count, and always the restless breathing of men too tired to dream. And yet, woven through the exhaustion was a quiet, haunting question that kept them awake. What would tomorrow bring? Rescue, capture, or nothing at all? That question is where we will drift next, into the shadows of uncertainty, where rumors of Soviet tanks, whispered tales of American cigarettes, and the strange bargains struck in ruined villages pull us further into the crumbling world of these final days. The rumors carried further than the commands, drifting through the ruins like smoke. And in those final days, a German soldier often lived more by whispers than by orders, whispers of Soviet tanks rumbling closer from the east, of Americans handing out chocolate in the west, of villages where you could trade a watch for a loaf of bread or a pistol for a bed in a hayloft. Imagine trudging down a road lined with blackened trees, each one scarred by artillery, and hearing a comrade mutter that the Americans were only 10 kilometers away, that they had real coffee and cartons of Lucky Strikes, that surrendering to them meant survival with dignity, while another comrade swore the Soviets were near and carried knives for vengeance rather than rations. The uncertainty made every step heavy. Which road to take, which rumor to follow, which strangers to trust. In one town, soldiers huddled in a cellar while a farmer's daughter slipped down the stairs to whisper that the British were coming, that they wore red berets and carried tins of jam. No one knew if she was telling the truth, but the image of jam jars glistening in the morning light lingered longer in their minds than any map of troop movements. Hunger reshaped imagination. Soldiers dug at frozen gardens for turnips, and some even cracked open books in abandoned schools not to read, but to tear the pages for rolling tobacco. A curious detail emerges from diaries. One soldier remembered, finding a half-burned globe in a ruined library and spinning it slowly, finger hovering over Africa, South America, places he knew he would never see but which seemed strangely alive. In that moment, as if the globe itself promised a world beyond rubble, the same soldier wrote that another comrade balanced the cracked sphere on his helmet and paraded around the cellar declaring himself emperor of nowhere. And the men laughed until they coughed from the dust. This humor was fragile, a flicker in the dark, but it mattered more than rations. Outside, the world collapsed in grotesque ways. Bridges blown to halt Soviet advance. Cows wandering through streets because their barns had burned. Church bells still tolling, though there were no services. Only hollow sound echoing through hollow towns. Soldiers sometimes slept in those churches, sprawled beneath frescoes of saints and martyrs, their rifles laid out on pews like offerings, their snores rising with the smell of wax and mildew. Strange contradictions defined these knights' men, who once marched in perfect formation, now fought over crumbs of bread. Men who had been ordered to show no weakness now shared tears quietly in shadows. One diary tells of a captain who gave his last chocolate ration not to his men, but to a starving child who wandered into their shelter. When asked why, he answered simply, "Because she believes tomorrow exists, and I don't." These small confessions carried more weight than any shouted speech. And yet the darker side pressed in. Prisoners shot for desertion even as whole companies deserted together. Soldiers executed by their own officers in barns that stank of straw and blood. And boys pressed into last stands with nothing but antique rifles from old wars. Imagine the silence after such moments, the kind where even the wind seemed ashamed to move. Still, even amid despair, there were odd sparks of tenderness. In one burned-out village, soldiers rigged up a phonograph with bits of wire, and for a single evening waltz music floated through walls blackened by fire. Some men danced awkwardly, boots scraping, others simply closed their eyes and pretended to be anywhere but here. That is perhaps the most human truth of these final days. Not the battles or the flags, but the quiet stubbornness to find fragments of life in the ruins, to laugh at a broken globe, to dance in ash. And always, the question loomed. Who would they meet first, the Soviets or the Americans? Vengeance or mercy? That question followed them into each night like a shadow. And in the next stretch of our story, we will walk closer to those encounters. When the sound of tank treads, the sight of unfamiliar uniforms, and the strange taste of foreign rations turned rumors into reality, the encounters began as distant sounds, tank treads growling like thunder under the earth. Voices carried on the wind that did not belong to their own language, and for German. Soldiers stumbling through villages in those final days. The question of who they would meet first became as haunting as hunger itself. Imagine standing at the edge of a ruined orchard, blossoms somehow blooming amid shattered branches, and hearing two rumors collide, that the Soviets were only hours away, and that the Americans had crossed the river, handing out chewing gum. To children, which direction was safety, and which was doom? Soldiers argued in whispers, their breath visible in the chill, some insisting it was better to walk west and take their chances with the Americans, others muttering that fate would drive them east regardless. There was no map now, only instinct and fear. In one account, a group of soldiers entered a farmhouse thinking it abandoned, only to find an old woman stirring a pot of nettle soup, who told them calmly in Saxon dialect, "The Americans are kind if you do not fight. The Russians, they do not forgive." They ate in silence, the soup bitter but warm, and when they left, one soldier slipped a medal into the woman's hand as if payment, though she tossed it into the fire the moment they walked away. Symbols burned faster than hunger. Along roadsides, surrender was rehearsed like ritual. Men practicing how to raise their hands slowly, how to say Nick Shigan with enough clarity to save their lives. Others discarding pistols in ditches, fearful that possession meant execution. Strangest of all were the bargains struck in these uncertain spaces. One group of soldiers traded binoculars to children, who promised to point the way to American lines. though the children themselves did not know which flags flew in the next town. Another group gave up rifles to a priest who swore to bless them and hide them in the bell tower until the storm passed, though no storm was pausing for blessings anymore. The emotional dissonance grew unbearable, some soldiers relieved to see white flags fluttering from windows, others furious at the sight, tearing them down in denial before exhaustion forced them to accept. Hunger warped perception. Some claimed they could smell chocolate before they saw Americans, while others swore they could hear the laughter of Soviet soldiers before the tanks even appeared. One soldier recorded in his journal that he dreamed of standing at a crossroads where the signposts spun endlessly, each arrow pointing toward an unknown fate, and when he woke he realized the dream was simply the truth of every waking step. Yet humor persisted in strange places. A soldier in Bavaria scribbled on a wall, "Whoever finds me, please feed me first. Interrogate later," and his comrades laughed until they coughed from dust and fatigue. Another was said to have asked a captured French laborer what the Americans were like, and the man replied with a grin, "Taller than you and always chewing," which somehow made the soldier less afraid. But beneath these fragile laughs lay the weight of collapse. Soldiers who stumbled eastward often did not return. Stories spread of captives marched into the cold with no food, of women and children caught in the vengeance of advancing armies. Meanwhile, those who drifted west found themselves before checkpoints, manned by strange accents and unfamiliar uniforms, where surrender meant not only survival, but the beginning of an entirely new identity, as prisoners, as displaced men, as fragments of a broken nation. In churches, men prayed not for victory, but for capture by the right enemy, a prayer as desperate as any offered in wartime. It is perhaps the strangest truth of those days. Survival hinged not on strength or strategy, but on accident, on the luck of walking left instead of right, of meeting one army before another. And as you lie here listening, eyes heavy, you could almost hear that crossroads. The soft rustle of spring leaves, the crunch of boots hesitating, the low murmur of men, deciding which way to wander, carrying not certainty, but hope that tomorrow would not end in silence. That uncertainty carries us forward now, into the heart of surrender itself, where the rituals of laying down weapons, of facing unfamiliar eyes, and of tasting foreign rations for the first time reveal how history is not only written in victories, but in the quiet gestures of men who no longer knew who they were supposed to be. Surrender, when it came, was not a single dramatic gesture, but 1,000 small ones scattered across the countryside, each with its own rhythm, its own peculiar weight. And for the German soldier, it was often less about banners and speeches and more about the careful choreography of raising empty hands toward men whose language he did not know. Picture a column of weary soldiers emerging from a forest at dawn, uniforms torn, boots caked with mud, their rifles left in a ditch half a mile behind. And as they step into a clearing, they see the unmistakable silhouettes of American soldiers, crouched behind sandbags, helmets shining faintly in the pale sun. The Germans freeze, breath heavy, and then slowly hands rise, fingers spread wide, palms open, an unspoken plea not to be mistaken for resistance. Some soldiers practice this in their minds for days, rehearsing how to appear harmless, how to walk slowly, how not to flinch when guns were pointed back at them. One diary recalls a man whispering, "We must look like beggars, not fighters." And so they hunched their shoulders and lowered their eyes. The Americans, wary but curious, moved forward, rifles trained, until one finally gestured for the Germans to approach. And then came the strangest moment. Instead of violence, instead of shouting, there was the sudden offering of food. A soldier was handed a Hershey bar, another given a cigarette, a third blinked in disbelief at the sight of canned meat. Imagine biting into chocolate after months of bitter turnip soup and acorn bread, the sweetness so sharp it brought tears. One German wrote that he laughed and cried at the same time, unable to explain how sugar could taste like mercy. Others marveled at the cigarette's smooth, fragrant, compared to the harsh leaves they had rolled in scraps of newspaper. Some were too weak to eat quickly, nibbling as though afraid the food might vanish. But surrender was not always so merciful. To the east, soldiers who laid down arms before Soviet troops were met with suspicion, anger, and in many cases, brutality. Accounts tell men stripped of boots, forced to march barefoot into the cold, or lined up for interrogation that began with fists before words. For them, surrender was not relief, but another layer of suffering, and fear of this fate is what drove so many westward, stumbling toward American lines, even if it meant walking for days without food. Yet even among the Americans, surrender carried strangeness. Germans were sometimes paraded past villages where children threw stones, or ordered to dig trenches not for defense, but for their own confinement. There is a curious note in one prisoner's journal. He describes being herded into a field with hundreds of others, ringed by barbed wire. And when night fell, the men were given not blankets, but American Army manuals to use as bedding, the irony not lost on them. Some laughed as they lay on diagrams how to assemble rifles they no longer possess, saying the manuals at least made better pillows than German propaganda leaflets ever did. Others, however, lay awake staring at the stars, wondering if they would see their families again. The rituals of surrender extended beyond food and beds. Watches were taken, knives confiscated, even photographs of wives or mothers sometimes seized under suspicion. And yet, amid humiliation, there were moments of startling humanity. An American guard who shared chewing gum with prisoners, showing them how to blow bubbles. Or another who sketched quick portraits of the men in charcoal, handing them back as keepsakes. These small acts softened the edge of defeat, reminding them that not every enemy sought vengeance. Still, the emotional collapse was deep. To hand over your weapon was not just to give up steel, but to surrender the last piece of identity that had defined you for years. One soldier described it as laying down the only anchor in a storm, and after that, drifting became inevitable. For some, the relief of safety allowed them to sleep for the first time in weeks, collapsing in ditches with chocolate still clutched in their hands. For others, shame gnawed more than hunger, the thought that they had fought and lost and that their homeland no longer existed as they knew it. And so, nights in captivity became strange mixtures of exhaustion and wonder. Laughter over canned peaches mixed with sobbing for lost comrades. Curiosity about American slang mingled with dread of what awaited when the war's final lines were drawn. Imagine lying under a foreign sky, the murmurs of guards in English, the smell of strong tobacco drifting through wire fences, and realizing that the war you had lived inside like a nightmare was no longer yours to carry. This is where we pause. Tonight, in the uneasy stillness of surrender between chocolate and chains, between mercy and humiliation, because what came after was not the end, but the long, uncertain journey of captivity. And that is where we will walk next. Captivity unfolded not as a single cage, but as a sprawling landscape of wire, mud, and waiting. And for German soldiers in those final days of World War II, the journey into prisoner of war camps became a strange, new existence, part punishment, part limbo, part relief from the terror of battle. Imagine hundreds of men herded into open fields ringed with barbed wire, no tents, no barracks, just the sky above and the ground below, where rain turned everything to sludge and sun baked the mud into cracked patterns that cut bare feet. These were the Rhine lager, the vast Rhine meadow camps where captured Germans, stripped of weapons and authority, were reduced to numbers scribbled on rosters. Some men stood in disbelief that after years of marching east and west across Europe, they now marched in circles inside wire. They built makeshift shelters out of cardboard, branches, even scraps of cloth tied together like sails, creating bizarre little villages within the camps, each hut a symbol of stubborn survival. Food was meager thin soup, hard bread, and men traded endlessly, a button for a cigarette, a belt buckle for a crust of bread, a fountain pen for an extra ladle of stew. Oddly enough, humor survived here too. One soldier reportedly drew a chalk sign over his shelter that read, Hotel Europa, and another set up a restaurant where he pretended to serve imaginary meals, rattling off menus of roast goose and dumplings while handing comrades pebbles in bowls. They laughed because laughing made hunger easier. At night, songs drifted over the wire, some old marching tunes, some hymns, some half-forgotten lullabies, and men who had once shouted commands now hummed softly to themselves like children. The darkest reality still crept in. Disease spread. Through the crowded enclosures, lice crawled in seams of clothing, and men weakened until they lay still on the mud, staring at the sky as if waiting for it to change. Diaries note how men chewed grass or dug up beetles, desperate for something to fill the void, while others closed their eyes and imagined entire meals in detail, describing them aloud as if speaking the memory could feed them. One account tells of a soldier sketching invisible lines in the dirt to map out the dining table of his childhood home, naming each dish potatoes, sauerkraut, sausages, until he wept with hunger. And yet, amid the despair, there were moments of startling tenderness. American guards sometimes shared extra rations, tossing tins of Spam over the wire or traded chewing gum for songs. In some camps, Germans were astonished to see African American soldiers among the guards, their presence contradicting years of propaganda that had painted such men as less than human. Now these guards were the ones offering water, cigarettes, or a stern word of order, and the paradox pressed deep into prisoners' minds. In Soviet captivity, the story turned Hershey trains crammed with men shipped eastward. Interrogations in dim rooms, long march into unknown lands, but in both east and west. The essence of captivity was the same: waiting, adjusting, remembering, and trying to stitch together identity from scraps. Odd details stand out. Men making chess sets from pebbles and carved sticks. Others weaving little animals from grass to pass the time, or writing diaries on toilet paper hidden inside boots. One soldier, desperate to keep a record, scratched words into a tin can and buried it beneath his shelter, hoping someday someone would read it. The mix of absurdity and sorrow gave captivity its surreal texture. There is a story of men celebrating Christmas in one camp by decorating a wire fence with scraps of cloth, singing carols while guards watched silently. Another account describes a group holding mock trials where comrades were sentenced for stealing bread but were always pardoned after laughter because no one wanted more punishment than the war had already given. As you let this image settle, imagine lying beneath a foreign sky, surrounded by thousands of men who were once enemies to the world, now enemies to no one but hunger and time, and realize that captivity was not just a condition, but a transformation. The soldiers who survived these camps will carry scars not only on their bodies, but in their dreamed scars of waiting, of barbed wire against the horizon, of nights where the only freedom was memory. And yet, even here, curiosity stirs. How long would captivity last? What work would be demanded? How would men rebuild their sense of self when the war had stolen everything else? These are the questions that carried them forward into the weeks and months ahead. And in our next part, we will follow them deeper into the strange rituals of camp life, the hidden economies, the friendships forged in mud, and the quiet hope that one day the wire would open and the world beyond would welcome them back. Life inside the barbed wire slowly turned into its own world, a universe bound by fences and guard towers where time stretched like an endless string, and German soldiers who had once lived by orders now lived by routines of their own invention, crafting a fragile sense of order in captivity. Imagine waking each morning to the sound of shuffling boots on mud, men lining up not for inspection, but for soup ladles. The watery broth steaming faintly in the chill air, each man silently calculating whether today's portion might last until dusk. Hunger shaped the rhythm of everything men thought in terms of bread, traded in terms of crumbs, and dreamed in terms of banquets. Entire microeconomies emerged. Cigarettes became currency, buttons stood in for coins, and a tin spoon could be worth more than a medal. One diary describes how a single American Red Cross parcel, when it arrived, was broken down into dozens of shares. each item carefully divided so that powdered milk, coffee, or chocolate could circulate through the camp like treasure. Strange businesses grew from this hunger-driven market. One man became known as a coffee merchant, mixing burnt barley with water and trading it as if it were real, while another carved miniature cones from wood and exchanged them for soap. Scraps. And then there was the banker, who kept track of debts in a notebook, tallying how many cigarettes one owed for a crust of bread or for a turn with a blanket. Humor softened this grim economy. One soldier hung a sign over his corner of the Camp Reading Cafe Berlin, open until liberation, and served bowls of hot water as if they were coffee, announcing the day's special with a grin. These playful acts didn't erase despair, but they gave men something to laugh at before sleep. Beyond trade, rituals sprouted like weeds. Soccer games with balls made from rags tied tight with wire. Choirs forming in the evenings to sing hymns. Or folk songs, lectures given by former teachers or professors who explained history, mathematics, even poetry to captive audiences eager to escape through thought. It is said that in some camps, men recited entire novels from memory, each one adding lines like a communal library rising in the mud. In darker corners, gambling thrived. Dice carved from bread hard as stone clattering against tin cups. The stakes offered nothing more than extra spoonfuls of soup or the promise of labor owed. Some found solace in creativity, carving figurines from bones left in stew, weaving bracelets from grass, even painting on scraps of cardboard with pigments made from ash and dirt. There is a haunting image of one soldier painting a sunrise with crushed brick dust and charcoal, hanging it on the wire so that men could pretend to look at hope. Yet captivity also revealed the fractures of men's spirits. Fights broke out over food. Men accused each other of theft, and despair sometimes dragged soldiers into silence, so deep they never rose from the mud again. The emotional weight press. Hardest at night, when guards' flashlights swept across sleeping forms and men turned in restless dreams. Some whispered to each other, sharing memories of home, describing the smell of bread from their mothers, kitchens, or the feel of grass in summer, as if words themselves could feed. Others plotted escapes, though few succeeded. The wire and watchtowers proving too sharp, too watchful. Yet still, rumors spread of comrades slipping away, of men tunneling under fences with spoons, of disguises made from stolen clothes. Even if these stories were exaggerated, they carried a spark of possibility, keeping men alive through imagination. Among the most unusual accounts is one of a soldier who organized university classes under the stars, teaching philosophy to anyone willing to listen. He opened each session with the line, "We are prisoners, but our thoughts are free." And men sat for hours debating whether freedom was a place or a state of mind. The camp became, in its own strange way, a distorted reflection of society. Traders, gamblers, teachers, comedians, mourners, all coexisting within barbed wire. Guards watched with curiosity, sometimes bemusement, sometimes harshness, for they too were caught in the monotony of waiting. Diaries tell us that guards sometimes accepted gifts of wooden carvings in exchange for small kindnesses, such as looking the other way when men lit fires from smuggled wood. And through all of this, the days blurred, one into the next, marked only by the slow turn of seasons and the unchanging horizon of fences. Imagine lying on the hard ground, head against a bundle of rags, staring at stars that were both familiar and strange, hearing the murmurs of men drifting into sleep, some humming, some weeping, some silent, and realizing that in captivity time is not measured by clocks, but by hope that the gates might open, that letters from home might arrive, that survival might stretch one more day. And so we move forward with them into the deeper endurance of months behind wire, where news of the outside world crept in like rumors carried by wind, and where the question grew louder with each passing day. When, if ever, would they be free? That is where we will go next, into the fragile thread of hope that bound prisoners to the world beyond the wire. News from the outside seeped into the camps like water through cracks. Never steady, never certain, but enough to stir restless minds. and shaped the fragile economy of hope among German soldiers who now counted their days not in battles but in rumors. Imagine sitting in the mud, back against a fence post, when a fellow prisoner leans in to whisper that the war is over, that Germany has surrendered, that Berlin has fallen, though no one has seen proof. The story spreads across the wire like wildfire, men turning to one another with cautious eyes, some smiling, some silent, some shaking their heads as if to ward off disappointment. A few days later, another rumor replaces the first, that the Americans will release them within weeks, that the British are preparing trains to take them home, that the French want labor and will keep them longer. In this swirl of contradiction, time itself felt untrustworthy, a shifting fog. And then, slowly, scraps of truth began to arrive, an American guard dropping a newspaper into the wire, men crowding around to see headlines they could barely read, but which showed photographs of flags over ruins, of faces they did not know. Some soldiers stared at the images in silence, unable to accept that the world had moved on without them, while others wept with relief that the endless war was finally finished. Letters began to arrive, smuggled or delivered through official channels, their paper soft from handling, their words trembling with both joy and sorrow. One man received a letter telling him his village had been spared, his family alive, and he walked in circles for hours murmuring their names as if summoning them closer. Another received a letter saying his home had been burned, his wife and children missing, and he sat in the mud with the paper in his lap until the rain dissolved the ink. These moments tore through the camp like lightning, hope and despair, sparking side by side. To pass the time, men clung to fragments of news, an allied guard mentioning elections in Britain, a fellow prisoner repeating the rumor of new borders being drawn, someone claiming to know about a peace conference happening somewhere far away. The absurdity of their knowledge was matched only by the seriousness with which it was shared. Some prisoners even made newspapers out of scraps of cardboard, writing headlines in charcoal. Liberation tomorrow. Soup thickened. Sun will rise again. It was mockery and ritual in equal measure. Humor found odd outlets. One soldier claimed he was the official weather forecaster of the camp, and each morning announced dramatic predictions. Today, rain mixed with liberation around noon, which made men laugh until the drizzle inevitably proved him half right. But underneath the laughter, despair grew heavy, especially as days turned to weeks, then months, and the gates stayed closed. Food remained scarce, and men grew thinner. Diaries speak of belts tightening by extra holes, of cheeks sinking until faces looked like skulls. And yet, survival persisted through imagination. Soldiers described their futures aloud as if to make them real. One dreamed of becoming a baker, another of planting apple trees, another of never wearing boots again. They built little models of houses from sticks, rehearsed family reunions, in whispers, told each other how they would rebuild lives they were not even sure still existed. There is an unusual detail from one camp. Men carved a large wooden wheel and mounted it upright in the mud, spinning it to decide who would go home today in play-acting ceremonies, cheering for the winner, even though everyone stayed. The game was absurd, but gave them a sense that destiny could be joked with, even tricked. Meanwhile, interactions with guards revealed contrasts. Some Americans and British grew friendly, handing out chocolate or cigarettes, listening to songs sung at night. Others remained cold, reminding prisoners daily that they were still the defeated enemy. In Soviet captivity, the news was darker. Men told they would never return, forced to sign confessions, marched to distant camps where no letters reached. And still, in both East and West, the act of waiting stretched endlessly, filling men with the peculiar mixture of relief that the war was finished and torment that freedom had not yet begun. Imagine lying down under the open sky at night, listening to the rustle of grass against barbed wire, the cough of a comrade beside you, the murmur of someone reading a letter aloud to men who had none, and realize that captivity was not just physical but mental, a test of patience and imagination. Some believed release was near and kept spirits bright. Others sank into silence, withdrawing into themselves, their eyes dull like extinguished lamps. And so the camps became places where hope itself was traded, where rumors were as valuable as bread, where a single word of home could feed a man longer than soup. This is where we leave them for now, waiting, yearning, inventing, clinging to scraps of truth and scraps of laughter, because ahead lay the slow unraveling of captivity into forced labor, long march, and the strange in-between life of men who had survived the war but not yet returned to themselves. When waiting turned into work, captivity shifted again, and German soldiers who had already surrendered their weapons now surrendered their strength, drafted into labor that blurred the line between punishment and survival. Their days filled not with battle cries, but with the scrape of shovels and the ache of backs bent beneath foreign skies. Imagine men once trained to march across Europe, now marching to dig ditches, repair roads, rebuild barns, or clear rubble from bombed-out cities they had never seen before. Uniforms now patched with civilian rags, boots torn open at the seams, hands blistered and raw. Some prisoners were sent to farms, their workdays shaped by milking cows, harvesting potatoes, or carrying water, a bitter irony for men who once dreamed of conquering empires now reduced to pulling plows beside horses. Yet even here, the strange mixture of hardship and humanity surface. There are accounts of soldiers working fields in France, where local villagers watched them silently, some spitting in contempt, others slipping bread into their pockets when guards looked away. In one case, a farmer's child is said to have run alongside the prisoners with an apple, holding it out nervously until one man took it and whispered, "Danke," a tiny exchange that carried more weight than the labor of the whole day. Labor camps were harsher quarries where stone dust choked lungs, forests where men swung axes until their arms trembled, factories where broken machines were repaired under watchful eyes. Hunger followed them into every task. Men stole sugar, beets from fields, hid scraps of grain in boots, or chewed grass between hauling stones. Diaries tell of men inventing recipes as they worked, describing to each other how they would cook imaginary meals, roast goose with chestnuts, bread rolls with butter until the ache in their stomachs felt both sharper and strangely soothed. Humor threaded itself into these rituals, fragile but persistent. One man, assigned to dig ditches, carved a wooden signpost that read Autobahn to freedom and planted in the mud, drawing laughter from his exhausted comrades. Another group, clearing rubble in a French town, pretended to argue like architects about how to redesign the city, sketching castles in the dust with sticks, before sweeping them away. These small absurdities kept despair from swallowing them whole. Yet the darkness remained close. Guards who struck men for slowing down, comrades collapsing from exhaustion and left behind, accidents that ended lives as suddenly as bullets once had. The contrast between East and West grew sharper while, in American or British custody, men sometimes worked under supervision with at least the promise of food. In Soviet hands, labor often meant endless march to distant camps, forests of Siberia where frostbitten hands froze to axes, mines where air thickened with coal dust until lungs gave out. Still, survival instincts adapted. Men fashioned gloves from burlap sacks, wrapped feet in straw when boots wore out, and learned to pace themselves, working just enough to last until night without collapsing before the eyes of guards. Odd traditions emerged, prisoners in some. Camps marked birthdays by sharing whatever scraps they had, passing around a single potato divided into 20 slivers, singing softly as if to remind themselves they were still human. In others, men wrote plays performed in barns with costumes, made of rags and scripts improvised from memory, laughter echoing briefly against walls where sorrow usually hung. These performances mattered because they allowed men to pretend for a night that they were free. And always there were whispers of release, of repatriation, of men being sent home sooner if they worked harder, though often these promises dissolved, like myths. Some men carved calendars into wood beams, scratching marks with nails, counting days like monks of a strange new monastery. Others gave up counting altogether, drifting into the endless present of labor and sleep. Imagine the rhythm. Wake to the bark of a guard, shuffle into work lines, hands blistering, stomach empty, body aching, then back to wire enclosures where super weighted, thin but hot, followed by the restless murmur of voices in the night. It was survival in its barest form, yet also a test of endurance that many passed not through strength, but through stubborn imagination. One man wrote in his diary that each stone he lifted was not just labor, but a promise to himself that he would one day tell the story of lifting it. That idea of surviving long enough to remember became a quiet vow shared by many. And so, captivity as labor reshaped them, humbling pride, deepening exhaustion, yet somehow preserving the spark that refused to go out. And as you drift further into this story tonight, eyes heavy, let the image rest with you. A line of men under gray skies. Shovels rising and falling, some humming old songs, some silent, some laughing at jokes too weary to repeat. All of them, caught between punishment and endurance, waiting still for the gates to open. For what lay beyond the gates was not always homecoming, but another stage of uncertainty. And in the next part, we will walk with them into that uncertainty, the long months when men wondered not just when they would be free, but who they would be when freedom finally came. Freedom, when it was finally spoken of, arrived first as a question rather than a certainty. And for the German soldier in captivity, it became a haunting refrain. Not only when would the gates open, but who would he be when they did? Imagine standing in the wire enclosure at dusk, the sky turning purple above, as a guard announces vaguely that some prisoners will be sent home soon, though no one knows who or when. The news travels through the camp like a ripple across water. Men perking up, some smiling, others suspicious, each one measuring the words against months of false promises. Release became a rumor like all the rest tomorrow, next week, before winter, never. Yet the idea of going home planted itself deep, and it began to reshape the way men thought. Some polished their boots with scraps of cloth, determined to walk back into their villages with dignity. Others rehearsed what they would say to wives or mothers, muttering apologies or blessings into the night. And some fell silent, afraid to imagine home for fear it no longer existed. Identity itself had. Frayed in captivity. Men who had once carried rank sergeant, corporal, captain were now simply prisoners, stripped of insignia, their names reduced to numbers scribbled on lists. One diary entry captures the strangeness. I was a soldier, then I was nothing. Perhaps I will become something else, if home still remembers me. This uncertainty gnawed at them as much as hunger had. They no longer knew if they were heroes, villains, victims, or survivors. For some, shame clouded every thought, the shame of fighting in a lost cause, of having followed orders into destruction. Others clung to a stubborn pride that they had endured where many had fallen. Even humor reflected this identity crisis. One soldier in a camp scrawled on a wall, "Yesterday a soldier, today a prisoner, tomorrow perhaps a farmer, or a ghost." And men chuckled quietly, though none dared erase the final word. The rituals of waiting grew stranger as release seemed nearer. Men carved combs to look respectable, wove belts from straw, even stitched together makeshift uniforms from scraps, as though preparing for a parade no one had announced. At the same time, they shared fears that wives might have remarried, that homes were rubble, that children would not remember their faces. Some joked grimly that freedom might feel more foreign than captivity, that the wire at least gave structure, while the world beyond had become unknown. There is an unusual account of prisoners staging mock releases inside the camp, lining up at the wire, marching out one by one through an imaginary gate, cheering and shaking hands before returning to their shelters, laughing bitterly at the absurdity of celebrating what they did not yet have. And yet, in these games lay a hidden strength, the ability to imagine a future. Guards noticed the tension too. Some encouraged men, promising they would go home soon. Others remained silent, their eyes betraying pity. In Soviet camps, men spoke less of release and more of survival, years stretching ahead with no clear end. But even there, Dreams of home kept men alive. Diaries tell of soldiers describing to each other the streets of their villages in meticulous detail, every door, every tree, so that memory itself became a place to inhabit when the present offered only mud and wire. And still, beneath the weight of uncertainty, men long for the smallest signs. When trains whistled beyond the camp, they wondered if those trains carried freed men. When guards handed out forms, they wondered if they were repatriation lists. When the sky broke into spring sunshine, some took it as a promise that freedom was near. Imagine lying on the hard ground at night, listening to the soft breaths of thousands of men around you, and asking yourself not only whether you will see home again, but whether you will recognize yourself when you do. The war had ended outside the wire, but inside it, the transformation of men's identities had only begun. And so, this is where we leave them tonight, suspended between past and future, waiting at the threshold of gates that might open, haunted not just by the question of when they will leave, but by the deeper mystery of who they will be when they step through. In the next part, we will follow them further into the uncertain first days of release, when the long-awaited journey home began, and when men discovered that freedom itself carried new challenges, new shocks, and new silences. When the wire finally opened, it did not swing wide with ceremony but creaked slowly, uncertainly, like a door that had forgotten how to move. And the German soldier stepping through it found that freedom itself felt unreal, fragile, even heavier than captivity had been. Imagine standing in line at dawn, the air still cold, while guards call out names from a list, each one echoing like a drumbeat across the camp. Men leaned forward as if the sound of their own name might summon life itself. Some shouted, "Higher," with voices cracked from disuse, while others whispered it as if afraid the spell might break. Those chosen were herded toward gates, where guards handed them slips of paper, identification documents, sometimes nothing more than a stamp card declaring them release, as if a scrap of ink could rebuild a world. The walkout was both. Solemn and surreal boots dragging on the same mud they had known for months, eyes scanning the horizon beyond the wire, which looked both familiar and foreign. Many hesitated, glancing back at comrades left behind, unsure whether to feel joy or guilt. One diary recalls a man clutching his release paper so tightly his hands bled from the creases. Another describes men laughing hysterically at nothing as they walked away, unable to process the flood of emotion. And then came the journey home, if home still existed. Trains carried them in cattle cars, packed tight, the air stinking of sweat and relief. Roads filled with columns of freed men trudging alongside refugees, each one marked by the same hollow eyes. At first there was wonder at simple things. Trees without barbed wire, fields without guards, rivers that flowed freely. Men stopped to touch grass, to wash their faces in streams, to breathe as though air itself were new. Yet the shock of freedom grew heavy quickly. Villages they passed were ruins, homes burned, bridges collapsed, entire towns hollow shells of what they remembered. Some men arrived at the edge of their hometowns only to find nothing but rubble, a silence more unbearable than captivity. Others returned to find strangers living in their houses, or families scattered, missing, buried. In one haunting account, a soldier wrote that he stood in front of the plot where his home had once been and whispered, "I survived the war to outlive my own life." Yet there were also moments of reunion that felt like miracles. Miracles. Some were greeted by mothers or wives who had never given up hope, arms wrapping around thin shoulders as if to hold them together. Children stared at fathers they did not remember, hesitant at first, then clinging fiercely once recognition bloomed. These scenes were no less overwhelming than the ruins, and many men confessed in diaries that they felt like ghosts walking among the living, unsure if they belonged. Humor, brittle but present, surfaced in strange ways. One man, stepping into his village, joked that at least the well still worked, so the ghosts can have water. Another wrote that his wife handed him a broom the moment he returned and told him the house needed sweeping. And he laughed until he wept, because sweeping felt more real than war ever had. but identity weighed on them still. Some villagers looked at them with suspicion, branding them as part of the machinery of destruction. Others looked with pity, seeing only broken men. Soldiers wrestled with their past in silence, rarely speaking of battles, often speaking only of hunger, mud, and waiting. Many sought work immediately, plowing fields, repairing roofs, as though labor itself could heal. Others wandered, unable to settle, haunted by memories that no one wished to hear. Imagine walking through a market as a freedman, hearing voices, smelling bread, feeling the crush of ordinary life, and realizing that captivity had changed the way the world looked, forever colors too bright, sounds too sharp, everything at once too alive and too fragile. For many, freedom was not a sudden rebirth, but a long unraveling, each day revealing both relief and emptiness. And yet, there was resilience too. Some planted gardens, some rebuilt barns, some sat in churches quietly, grateful simply to breathe air without wire above them. Diaries tell of men who wrote long lists of what they had survived, not as boasts but as prayers. Mud, lice, hunger, frost, waiting, sorrow, fear, yet still here. This act of naming became a way to anchor themselves in the present. Still, beneath it all, the question remained, could they ever return to who they had been? Or had the war rewritten them completely? That is the quiet mystery that carried forward into their first days of release, and it is where our story bends next, into the fragile, uneven path of rebuilding life, when freedom was no longer about gates opening, but about learning how to live again in a world that no longer felt the same. Rebuilding life was less a triumphant return and more a quiet confrontation with absence. And for the German soldiers stepping back into a homeland scarred beyond recognition, freedom proved to be its own battlefield, one fought not with rifles, but with silence, hunger, and the stubborn labor of hands. Imagine walking into a village you had carried in memory through months of captivity only to find it flattened. Roofs caved in, chimneys standing like broken teeth against the sky. For some men, homecoming was a reunion, but for many others, it was a reckoning. They found families dispersed, farms abandoned, shops looted, churches with shattered windows. One soldier described returning to his parents' house only to discover that the door opened onto a field of rubble, a pile of bricks where the kitchen once stood, and he stood there for hours with his release paper in his hand, as though the paper itself could order the ruins back into walls. Others did find their families waiting, but even that joy carried strangeness, wives who had grown older in his absence, children who did not recognize the thin, hollow-eyed figure before them, parents who wept as if greeting a stranger. In many households, silence replaced celebration. Diaries note how men rarely spoke of the war. They told, instead of mud, of hunger, of captivity, but not of battles, not of commands. It was as though those memories were too sharp to touch, so they wrapped them in silence and buried them in chores. Villages echoed with the sound of rebuilding hammers striking nails, axes splitting wood, voices calling instructions, but beneath the rhythm of work lay the slow process of rediscovering identity. Men who had been soldiers now became farmers, carpenters, laborers. Some slipped back into old roles with relief, glad to trade rifles for plows. Others found themselves restless, unable to sleep in beds after so many months on hard ground, unable to sit at tables without scanning the door. A curious detail recurs in letters and diaries. Many returned soldiers slept outside in barns or gardens, even when beds were offered, saying they felt more comfortable under the open sky, that roofs pressed too heavily on their memories. And humor surfaced in odd corners. One man, after weeks of sleeping outdoors, joked that he would never again pay rent since the stars are cheaper landlords. Another wrote that he mistook the sound of his children playing for enemy patrols, then laughed at himself until tears came. The mixture of laughter and sorrow became the language of recovery. Communities stitched themselves together with what they had shared: tools, pooled rations, songs sung in the evenings to remind themselves of continuity. Yet the shadows of guilt and shame lingered. Some neighbors looked at returning soldiers with suspicion, blaming them for the destruction, while others welcomed them with pity, seeing only men broken by war. In cities, freed soldiers joined the endless streams of displaced people, searching for food tickets, waiting in long lines for ration cards, bartering watches for potatoes, boots for coal. Hunger followed them still, long after the wire. There are accounts of men weeping in markets when they saw bread loaves piled on stalls, not because they could buy them, but because they remembered the days when a crust was worth a life. In rural places, men sometimes rebuilt farms with their bare hands, planting fields with determination that seemed almost desperate, as if forcing the earth to grow again could erase the ruins around them. Churches reopened with cracked bells, and in their pews sat both mourners and survivors, side by side, whispering prayers that sounded more like sighs. Some men wrote poetry on scraps of paper, words spilling out in halting lines about hunger, love, and the weight of memory. Others painted, sculpted, or simply carved initials into trees, leaving marks to prove they were still here. Yet many carried silence as their only language, a silence that stretched into marriages, into families, into generations, unspoken but heavy. Imagine lying in bed in a rebuilt house, hearing the creak of timbers, the laughter of children in another room, and yet feeling the wires still around you, the mud still beneath you, the hunger still gnawing at your belly. Freedom did not erase captivity. It folded into it, a shadow that followed them through the rest of their lives. And so, rebuilding became not only about houses and fields, but about identities. Were they heroes, victims, survivors, or simply men who endured? That question shaped every handshake, every meal, every moment of laughter that came too suddenly, every silence that lasted too long. And it is into that silence we now continue, because in the next part we will follow how these men, carrying their quiet burdens, lived through the uneasy years after the war years, where memory became both a wound and a tool, and where survival was measured not in battles, but in the fragile act of living each ordinary day. The uneasy years after the war unfolded like a long twilight for the German soldier who had returned home, because survival did not end with release, it merely changed. Shape, taking the form of silence, memory, and the slow, uneven rhythm of ordinary days that no longer felt ordinary. Imagine men who had once marched in columns now standing in bread lines, ration cards in their hands, their stomachs still tightening with the same hunger they had known behind wire. Cities were seas of rubble, streets winding through mountains. Of brick and ash, children playing in bomb craters as though they were sandpits, mothers scavenging wood from collapsed walls to burn for warmth. The soldiers blended into this broken landscape, often unrecognizable even to themselves, their uniforms stripped, their identities unmoored. Diaries speak of men waking in the night from dreams of captivity, still feeling the weight of Barbed. Wire across their chests, still hearing the clatter of boots at roll call. Some confess they felt freer behind the wire than outside it, because at least captivity had offered structure, while freedom offered only uncertainty. They carried silence with them like an extra limb silence at tables when asked about the war, silence in churches when prayers turned to politics, silence with children who wanted stories. It was a silence both protective and corrosive, keeping horror locked away but also walling off intimacy. Some filled the silence with work, throwing themselves into rebuilding, stacking bricks, plowing fields, repairing bridges, moving their bodies until exhaustion became a kind of escape. Others turned inward, keeping notebooks filled not with facts but with fragments, a single remembered smell, a song, a joke, a face glimpsed before sleep. Odd details reveal how memory intruded on daily life. One man carried a stone in his pocket, from the camp quarry where he had labored, rubbing it between his fingers whenever he felt overwhelmed. Another kept the tin spoon he had eaten from in captivity, using it at every meal even when silverware was available, as though the spoon itself was a thread tying him to survival. Humor, fragile as ever, surfaced in unexpected places. Men joked about ration cards as tickets to eternity, or about ruins being the biggest construction project in Europe. Laughter rising thin and weary, but real enough to lift spirits. Children often became the bridge between silence and speech. Soldiers who could not talk to adults about war found themselves telling bedtime stories that twisted their memories into softer shapes. Tales of hunger turned into stories of clever foxes, of cold nights turned into adventures under starlight. Yet trauma slipped through even in these softened forms, shaping generations without words. And in the shadows of laughter lay shame. Some men avoided gatherings altogether, ashamed to face neighbors who had lost family to bombings, or to speak. Of battles fought for a regime now reviled. Others hid among the displaced, never returning to their hometowns at all, preferring anonymity in cities where no one knew their past. But even amid this heaviness, there were glimpses of resilience. Music drifted again from rebuilt taverns. Festivals returned in cautious forms, churches filled with hymns sung louder than before, as though voices could stitch wounds together. Soldiers danced awkwardly at weddings, their movements stiff from years of drills but softened by smiles. Gardens sprouted in rubble, flowers blooming defiantly among stones. And for many returning men, planting seeds became the truest act of hope. Imagine kneeling in dirt, pressing a seed into the soil, and whispering to yourself that something new will grow, even if you do not yet believe it. These gestures of survival mattered because they redefined life in ways war had nearly erased. Still, the tension of memory never faded completely. Some men confessed decades later that they still smelled mud whenever it rained, or still heard phantom boots behind them in crowded streets. The war had ended, but inside them it lingered as a ghost. And yet, perhaps this lingering was also what kept them alive. Memory not only as wound, but as thread, binding them to a world they had endured, reminding them that survival itself was testimony. This is where we pause for now, in the uneasy quiet of post-war years, where laughter and silence coexisted, where seeds were planted in rubble, and where the question of who these men had become weighed as heavily as any weapon they once carried. In the next part, we will move deeper into this twilight into the decades that followed, when former soldiers learned to live with memory not as enemy but as companion, and when the past refused to fade even as the future demanded to be built. Decades that followed became a strange kind of second captivity for many German soldiers, because even after homes were rebuilt, families rejoined, and new lives began, the past remained like a shadow that never left the room, shaping the way. They lived, loved, and remembered. Imagine a man sitting at his kitchen table in the 1950s, the smell of fresh bread on the air, children laughing outside, his wife humming as she folds laundry, and yet his hands tremble slightly as he holds the cup of coffee because the steam reminds him of the thin soups ladled out behind barbed wire. He smiles, nods, joins the rhythm of family life, but inside he is somewhere else. Diaries from these years reveal how the war slipped into everyday routines in quiet ways. Some men refused to waste food, scraping plates clean with a stubbornness that puzzled their children. Others hoarded bits of bread in pockets even when pantries were full. Many avoided loud noises, fireworks, hammering, sudden knocks on doors, which made them flinch as if artillery had returned. Some slept lightly, waking at the slightest sound, and preferred to keep boots by their bed, a habit from years when escape could be a matter of seconds. And yet, they rarely spoke of these things. Silence remained the most common inheritance of war. Men built careers, raised families, attended festivals, but when conversations drifted toward the past, they often turned away or shrugged, muttering only, "Ease wore slim." It was bad before falling quiet. Memory was both enemy and companion. Enemy when it dragged them into sorrow, companion when it reminded them they had survived. Odd details of coping stand out. Some men kept pigeons, saying the birds calmed them, perhaps because they reminded them of the endless skies they had stared at in captivity. Others gardened obsessively, planting rows of vegetables with military precision as though order in. The soil could heal chaos in the mind. There is an account of a man who planted potatoes every year on the exact date of his release, calling it his real birthday, a private ritual of gratitude and mourning. Humor, brittle but enduring. Surface 2. Veterans gatherings often included jokes about camp life, men laughing about the watery soups, about trading buttons for cigarettes, about Hotel Europa, where mud was the carpet. These jokes carried pain underneath, but laughter allowed them to touch memory without burning. Still, darker currents lingered. Some men carried shame that never lifted, a shame not only of defeat, but of the regime they had served, even if they had been little more than pawns. Others struggled with guilt over comrades who had not returned, replaying moments when survival felt like betrayal. For some, the war seeped into dreams for the rest of their lives, dreams of fences, of boots, of hunger, and their spouses learned to shake them gently awake when the murmurs turned to cries. And yet, alongside these wounds, resilience shone. Many found purpose in teaching their children never to repeat such mistakes, speaking not of battles, but of kindness, of hunger, of the need to share. Some volunteered in communities, some wrote memoirs late in life, finally allowing words to carry what silence had borne for decades. Others left only fragments, a spoon kept in a drawer, a diary locked in a chest, a single story told once and never again. Imagine visiting such a man in his later years, sitting in a modest home, photographs of grandchildren on the walls, and hearing him chuckle softly at a memory of carving dice from bread, his eyes distant but gentle. In that moment, the past feels both unbearably far and impossibly close. For many, the war became not something they escaped, but something they carried folded inside them, a secret language of survival that shaped everything they touched. And this is where our story drifts next, not into the battles or ruins anymore, but into the inner landscapes of memory, into the way men learned to live with ghosts, and how the act of remembering, even silently, became a form of endurance as the years turned into decades. Memory itself became a kind of second battlefield for the German soldier who had once wandered the ruins of 1945, because even when the rubble was cleared and children played in streets rebuilt with new bricks, the past did not disappear. It only shifted into quieter forms, lingering in dreams, in habits, in the unspoken language of survival that seeped into every gesture. Imagine an old man in the 1960s, dressed neatly in a coat for Sunday church, his hair silver now, his hands rough from work, smiling politely as neighbors greet him, yet carrying inside him the image of barbed wire under moonlight, of boots sinking in mud, of chocolate that once tasted like salvation. These memories would surface without warning, the smell of cabbage reminding him of thin soup ladled from rusted pots, the sound of gravel under a cartwheel recalling forced march, the flicker of a flashlight at night stirring panic before he realized it was only his son walking through the hall. Diaries from these years show how men learned to live with ghosts not by forgetting them, but by weaving them into ordinary life. Some carried odd talismans, like a tin cup or a spoon. From captivity, using them daily as quiet reminders of survival. Others developed rituals that no one around them understood, always finishing every scrap of food, refusing to throw away bread crusts or storing matches and bits of string in jars just in case. These were not eccentricities to them, but lifelines, threads binding the present to the will that had kept them alive. Humor still flickered, often as camouflage. Veterans teased one another about their thin hair or stiff backs, but in quieter circles, they still laughed about Hotel Europa, about trading buttons for soup, about singing in mud to drown out hunger. Sometimes their children or grandchildren would overhear and be puzzled by the laughter that carried such heaviness, but the men themselves found relief in it, proof that they could hold the past without being destroyed by it. Yet darkness lingered too. Nightmares returned often, sometimes decades later, with such intensity that wives shook their husbands awake to stop the murmured pleas in foreign tongues. Some men confess only in old age that they never slept without hearing boots behind them, or that every silence felt like waiting for a roll call. Others carried guilt that gnawed through the years, guilt for battles fought in service of a cause they no longer believed in, guilt for comrades left behind, guilt for surviving when others had not. And yet, resilience grew alongside this sorrow. Many turned memory into teaching, speaking to younger generations not of tactics or glory, but of hunger, cold, and endurance, telling their children to share food, to value kindness, to never march blindly into destruction again. In some villages, former soldiers gathered on anniversaries not to celebrate, but to sit quietly together, drinking weak beer, telling small stories, sometimes crying without shame. Odd, tender details remain from these gatherings. Men passing around a loaf of bread as if it were sacred, breaking it into pieces, eating slowly, their eyes wet, their silence deeper than any speech. Others turned to gardens, planting vegetables with military precision, each row like a prayer. One man was known to plant sunflowers every spring, explaining to neighbors that their tall heads reminded him of guards, but he said it with a smile, because for him the flowers meant that even guards could turn into light. Imagine walking past such a garden, hearing laughter from grandchildren playing, and seeing an old soldier bending in the soil, his back curved, but his hands steady, sowing seeds as if scattering fragments of memory into the earth. This is how many lived, not by forgetting, but by transforming. And as the decades stretched, memory itself became a companion, sometimes heavy, sometimes kind, sometimes arriving in the night as fear, sometimes in the day as gratitude for survival. The war had ended, but inside them it continued as a presence that shaped every choice, every silence, every laugh. And so, as we drift further, we move with them into the quiet autumn of their lives, when memories softened into reflection, and when the question was no longer how to survive, but how to live, with the shadows that would never fully leave. That is where we go next, into the twilight years of these men, when the past became both wound and wisdom, and when the act of remembering itself became their final legacy. In the twilight years, when hair had turned white and the pace of steps had slowed, the German soldier of the final days of World War II carried his memories not as weapons, but as companions, shadows that walked beside him into old age, sometimes heavy, sometimes softened, but never gone. Imagine an old man sitting in a chair by the window of a small rebuilt house, sunlight slanting across the floor, his hands folded in his lap as he watches children play in the street where ruins once stood. And in his silence lives both relief and sorrow. By now, the routines of survival had long since woven into ordinary life, but memory had a way of returning when the world grew quiet. You might smile at the sight of bread on a table, yet feel an echo of hunger so sharp it made his throat tighten. He might laugh with grandchildren, yet flinch at the crack of fireworks in summer, his heart racing as if the sky had been torn open by shells again. Some of these men became storytellers in their final years, opening up for the first time about the camps, the mud, the strange small details of surrender, their voices halting but firm, as though the weight of silence had finally grown too heavy to keep. Others remained closed, carrying their memories to the grave, leaving only a spoon, a diary, or a single whispered story behind. Diaries and oral histories tell us of unusual rituals these old men kept. One who still polished his boots every Sunday morning, though he rarely left the house. Another who carried a folded piece of barbed wire in a pocket like a talisman. Another who marked the anniversary of his surrender with a quiet walk to the local river, standing by the water until the bells rang noon. Humor remained, delicate but real. In veteran circles, now smaller each year, they laughed at themselves for needing canes, joking that marching has gotten shorter, or that soup was still the meal of choice because we trained for thin broth for a lifetime. Yet even in laughter, sorrow sat nearby. Wives sometimes describe how their husbands woke in the night, whispering names of comrades long dead, or murmuring phrases in broken fragments of English or Russian, as though speaking again to guards in dreams. For many, memories soften not by vanishing, but by blending into gratitude. They held grandchildren on their knees, watching the play of innocence they once thought impossible, and tears welled quietly as they whispered thanks that the future had come despite everything. In gardens, they planted flowers with the same careful order once given to trenches, rows neat and straight, but now the labor was gentle, meant not for survival, but for beauty. Some found peace in rituals of remembrance, lighting candles on anniversaries, visiting cemeteries not only for family but for unnamed dead, speaking softly to gravestones as though comrades could still hear. And yet, the question of identity lingered even in old age. Who had they been? Villains, victims, survivors, witnesses? The answer never arrived neatly, but perhaps it was in the act of living quietly, of tending gardens, of sharing bread, that they shaped the legacy beyond war. Imagine one such man in the late 1970s, standing in a rebuilt town square, watching his grandson play soccer and remembering his own games with rag balls in camps. He smiles, though his chest aches with the memory, because what once was survival has now become joy. These twilight years became a kind of reconciliation, not with politics or history, but with themselves, a slow acceptance that memory would never leave, but neither would life. And so, as we drift with them into the final chapters of their journey, we find not battles or barbed wire, but quiet evenings, candles flickering, photographs fading, and the steady breath of old men who once stood on the edge of collapse, but who lived long enough to see silence turn into wisdom. That is where we go next, into the final reflections of these soldiers' lives, where memory became story, and story became inheritance for the generations that followed Dot in their final reflections, as the arc of life bent toward its quiet close. The German soldiers of 1945 became not only survivors of a war, but carriers of memory, and the way they passed that memory on, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, became their last act of endurance. Imagine an old man sitting with his grandchildren in the late 1980s, his voice low, his hands trembling slightly as he tells a story not of battles but of bread, describing the taste of a crust shared among 5 men in a muddy camp, and the children. Listen with wide eyes, not fully understanding, but sensing that this memory carries a weight far greater than its simplicity. Many veterans chose to speak late in life, breaking decades of silence, their words halting but vivid, not of strategy or politics, but of hunger, of fear, of the humor that kept them alive. Oral histories record stories of men recalling how they made chess pieces from bones, or how an American guard once handed them chocolate, or how laughter over a broken phonograph carried them through a night of despair. These details became gifts to younger generations, tokens of survival disguised as anecdotes. Others remained silent to the end, their families piecing together fragments from objects left behind, a diary hidden in a chest, a spool with initials carved into its handle, a folded release paper tucked into a Bible. For them, silence itself was a form of memory, heavy but protective. Communities, too, became inheritors of these stories. In village squares rebuilt from rubble, anniversaries were marked not only by speeches, but by the quiet presence of men standing together, hats in hand, eyes cast down, remembering comrades whose names were never carved into stone. Sometimes they spoke aloud. Sometimes they did not need to memory pass between them in glances, in the act of standing side by side. Humor, even here, softened the heaviness. One veteran, asked by a schoolchild what captivity had been like, replied, dryly, "We had excellent soup, if you like water," and the room laughed gently, though behind the joke lingered the ache of truth. Another man quipped in his final years that the war had left him with a doctorate in potatoes, because he had eaten them in every possible form, raw, boiled, stolen. Imagine, and his children repeated the line for years after he was gone. These small bits of levity became part of family lore, ways of holding the past without being crushed by it. Yet there were darker confessions, too. Some men admitted regret, not only for their suffering, but for their participation in a cause that had left scars on the world. Diaries and late interviews reveal men who struggled with guilt, ashamed of uniforms they once wore, wrestling with the question of whether survival was absolution or burden. They passed this awareness on as cautionary wisdom, urging younger generations to question authority, to resist blind obedience, to value humanity over ideology. Imagine sitting in a modest living room, the wallpaper faded, the clock ticking softly, and hearing an old man murmur to his grandson, "Never follow orders without asking where they lead." In that moment, memory transforms from wound to guidance, from silence to inheritance. For some, their final years were marked by small rituals of remembrance, lighting a candle each May to mark surrender, planting trees for lost comrades, or walking each morning to a cemetery to speak aloud the names of those who had not returned. These acts, gentle and persistent, carried memory into the soil of the present. And when death finally came, families often describe how their fathers or grandfathers slipped away quietly, sometimes with a sigh, sometimes with a single whispered word from the past. One man at the end murmured chocolate and his family realized he was remembering the Hershey bar handed to him at surrender decades earlier. Another whispered the name of a comrade, his voice fading before the final breath. In these moments, memory revealed itself as both burden and blessing, the final companion on a long road. And so, the legacy of these soldiers was not the battles they fought, nor the politics they served, but the way they endured, remembered, and transformed survival into story. As you drift deeper into this tale, imagine these voices fading like candle flames, their memories now carried by children, grandchildren, and strangers who listen, so that what was once suffering becomes a lesson, what was once silence becomes testimony. And this is where we continue, into the closing chapters of their lives, when memory no longer belonged to them alone, but became part of history itself, a thread woven into generations who would never see the wire, but who would still feel it. Shadow dot as the last soldiers aged, and their voices grew faint. Their memories began to shift from private testimony to collective history, slipping out of kitchens and gardens into books, interviews, and ceremonies, where their lived experiences transformed into echoes that would shape how future generations understood the war's final days. Imagine an old man in the 1990s, his hands trembling as he speaks into a tape recorder for a local historian, telling of mud and hunger, of surrender under gray skies, of chocolate that once felt like a miracle. His voice cracks, but the words are captured, stored, and eventually placed in archives where strangers will listen decades later. In this way, memory became not only inheritance within families, but part of the world's larger fabric. Communities across Germany began to host remembrance events, sometimes solemn, sometimes quiet, where old soldiers stood beside civilians, each holding their own fragments of the past. Some men refused invitations, unwilling to relive what they had tried so hard to bury, while others stepped forward at last, standing in schools to speak to children about what it meant to endure hunger, to watch comrades fade, to wait behind, wire for gates that might never open. And yet, even as these testimonies were shared, silence remained just as powerful. Many soldiers left behind no words at all, only artifacts. A rusted mess tin, a worn photograph, a diary filled with smudged ink. Families, sorting through belongings after their deaths, found these objects tucked into drawers, folded into boxes, hidden under floorboards. Each discovery was like a whispered story without sentences, leaving descendants to imagine what their fathers or grandfathers had carried. Some of the most unusual legacies appeared in unexpected places. A farmer who continued planting potatoes on the anniversary of his release, his children later wondering why that date mattered so much. A carpenter who built a wooden chest lined with scraps of barbed wire, never explaining it, only polishing the wood until it gleamed. A tailor who stitched pockets into every coat he made, explaining simply, "You never know when you'll need to hide bread." These gestures were fragments of memory turned into habit, ordinary acts that spoke volumes without words. Humor lingered too, often retold by families as legends. Children grew up hearing about Hotel Europa, about dice carved from bread, about the doctorate in potatoes, and though they laughed, they also understood that laughter itself was survival. The stories passed down became a curious mixture of sorrow and warmth, shaping how the war was remembered not only as destruction, but as endurance. Public memory followed a similar pattern. In some towns, plaques were placed not only for the fallen, but for the missing, acknowledging those who had returned as shadows of themselves. In others, museums displayed artifacts from POW camp sting cups, carved figurines, spoons etched with initials, objects so ordinary yet so profound in their testimony. By the late 20th century, school children studied these histories, sometimes invited to meet elderly veterans who spoke softly of captivity, not glorifying, not condemning, simply describing. The presence of these men in classrooms was both unsettling and humanizing, living bridges between a past of unimaginable scale and the fragile ordinariness of memory. And yet, as the years passed, fewer voices remained. By the early 2000s, many of these former soldiers had passed away, their memories now entirely in the hands of families, historians, archivists. Imagine walking through a cemetery where stones mark dates of birth in the 1920s and deaths in the early 2000s, and realizing that the generation who once marched through ruins is vanishing. The silence grows larger, and history fills the gaps. But silence does not mean absence. The stories they left behind, whether spoken, written, or hidden in gestures, continue to ripple outward. Today, children and grandchildren carry them. As part of family lore, sometimes in pride, sometimes in sorrow, sometimes in quiet confusion about what it means to inherit memories of both suffering and complicity. For the soldiers themselves, those who lived long enough to see their words recorded, there was a strange mixture of relief and unease. Relief that their experiences would not be forgotten. Unease at knowing they had become symbols and narratives larger than themselves. Imagine being one of the last survivors, standing at a memorial ceremony surrounded by candles flickering in the evening, and hearing the names of comrades long gone. You nod, bow your head, perhaps murmur a prayer, and in that moment you are both man and memory, both witness and symbol. This is the final transformation of their story, from lived pain into shared inheritance, from hunger and mud into words and silence that continue to shape how the world remembers. And as we drift deeper into these echoes, we move toward the final chapters, where the last voices fade, and what remains is not the soldiers themselves, but the lessons carried forward in memory, silence, and story. Perhaps now, as our story draws to a close, your eyes are heavy, and you're breathing slow, and you can imagine the last threads of this history settling like dust in a quiet room. What began as the noise of collapsing fronts, of soldiers wandering, broken roads, of hunger and surrender, has softened into silence, into the memory of men who once carried rifles and later carried only stories or silence itself. The German soldier in the final days of World War II was not the figure of parades or posters, but a man standing in ruins, clutching bread, trading jokes in mud, whispering names of comrades under barbed wire skies, and then walking home into a world that no longer resembled the one he had left. He lived with the war press inside him for decades, carried it into gardens, into bedtime stories, into the way he planted seeds or flinched at thunder. And at last, when his voice faded, he left fragments for the living in old spoon, a diary, a joke, a ritual. These fragments became inheritance, and through them his memory survived long after his footsteps ended. And so tonight, as you drift between waking and sleep, think of how memory itself is an act of survival, how silence can carry as much truth as words, how even the smallest gestures, a crust of bread shared, a sunflower planted, a laugh in the mud can echo across generations. Maybe your own life, with its ordinary rituals, its small acts of kindness, its quiet endurance, will someday be remembered the same way, not for battles or victories, but for the way you lived gently through difficulty. And as your eyes finally close, perhaps you will hear the hush of those long vanished nights, the murmur of men waiting for dawn behind wire, the faint laughter over watery soup, the soft prayer whispered to no one and everyone, and you will. Know that their story has been carried forward, not in sorrow but in stillness, not as weight but as witness. Sleep now, and let the last voices rest. Tomorrow the world will continue, and their memory, like yours, will move quietly with it.